Hey, everybody. Can you believe it? We're already now on to week two of this very, very, very condensed class. If you think about it, if this were a normal semester, we'd be on about week, I don't know, 7. And so here we go. We're going to move into the next week. We're going to move into, I think, one of the most interesting groups of people to ever have lived on the earth, and that is the ancient Greeks. From the ancient Greeks, we get some of the greatest literature, some of the greatest philosophy, some of the greatest ideas, and some of the greatest art in the world's history, so much so that their art will affect the Romans, will affect the Europeans, will affect the Americans. This is really the beginning for some people of what we think of as modern civilization, at least in the Western sense. This week, though, we're going to be looking at two works in particular. We're going to be looking at Homer's The Odyssey. Now, the Odyssey is a sequel to his other great epic poem, the Iliad, which is the central myth of the Greeks. Now, Iliad comes from the word Ilium, which means Troy. So it's the story of Troy. The battle there at Troy between the Trojans and all the various city states of the Greeks is the central myth of the Greeks and also the central myth of the Romans. Now, after the war, a 10-year war, everybody gets to go home except for Odysseus. Odysseus is going to spend 10 more years trying to get home. And we're going to follow his story along with his son Telemachus and his wife Penelope as they try to negotiate another 10 years of trying to get home. Now, they didn't have internet, they didn't have telephones. So Penelope and Telemachus have no idea if Odysseus is even still alive. In the meantime, Odysseus is trying everything to get home. He's fighting gods and goddesses and storms and himself. But then we're also going to look at what I think is the single most important play in the history of the Western world, and that is Oedipus Rex. And I've actually given you a link to a YouTube of a production of the play that I think you'll find interesting because they perform it as the Greeks would have done with masks. And the masks serve several purposes. One is, of course, they're beautiful. The other is it allowed actors to play several different roles, but it may also have had the role of projecting their voices because some of the theaters in Greece could seat as many as 15,000 people, and there wasn't a sound system. But this is such an interesting play. It's about a man named Oedipus who, even before he was born, was predicted, fated, if you will, to kill his father and marry his mother. So everybody in his life, everybody is going to do whatever they can to make sure he doesn't kill his father and marry his mother. The problem is, in trying to do that, they're going to do everything that must be done to make him kill his father and marry his mother. And so we're going to talk about fate. And how much control do we have over our lives? Do we have any control at all? And I think this is relevant even for us as Christians, because we as Christians still grapple with the idea of fate. How much control do we have over our lives? Are there outside forces actually affecting our outcomes, actually affecting our lives? But I also want to point out that now that you've done one paper, I would like to point out another paper that will be due not at the end of this week, but at the end of our 3-week term. And I'm calling it Wrestling with the Angel because one of my favorite Bible stories is of Jacob wrestling with the angel. Out of that all-night tussle, he ends up with a limp, but he also ends up with a new name, Israel. I would argue that he ends up with knowledge. So I'm asking you actually to write a paper, not unlike the one you just did, that's essentially an opinion paper based on the use of the text, but I want you to write about a concept that you have heard either in one of the lectures or perhaps you read in one of the texts that we saw or read. And you could choose perhaps the monomyth, you could choose fate or fatalism, heroism, polytheism, monotheism. All of these are interesting ideas. The femme fatale, the dangerous female, which we'll also talk about. All of these are possibilities, and you have 2 weeks to work on it. So you'll have just 2 papers in the class. You'll have the one that is due on the 7th, and then one that is due on the 21st. And so if you keep up with all of your assignments, along with doing this paper, then I think you're going to do just fine. Make sure if you get a chance to watch the film versions of the 2 stories that we're looking at this week, because I think that will help. I don't mean those to be a replacement of reading the texts, but I also understand that it's a very, very concentrated period of time that we're trying to cover some pretty weighty works. And I think that these will help you a little bit, especially the Oedipus play. Now, I think the film version is great fun. It pegs my Dorco meter a little bit. It gets a little cheesy. It's a made-for-TV version of the Odyssey. Sometimes it takes some liberties, but for the most part, it keeps to the story fairly well. Anyway, I think you're going to find it fun. We're going to have a great time. Let's get started and let's have a fantastic week.